I've got 50 shocking details from the Hunger Games books that never made it to the movies, and I guarantee you haven't heard them all. Some of these facts are going to make you laugh, some will make you angry, and others might even make you cry. But by the end, you're going to see the Hunger Games in a whole new light. Think you can handle it? Let's find out. Let me tell you about the mutts in the 74th Hunger Games. If you've only seen the movies, you're missing out on some seriously messed up details. The film showed these creatures as scary wolf-like monsters, but that's not even close to the full story. In the books, these weren't just random mutated animals, they were something way more twisted. The Capitol actually created these mutts using the DNA of the dead tributes. Yeah, you heard that right. They took genetic material from the kids who already died in the arena and used it to create these horrific monsters. But it gets even worse. Each mutt had the eyes of a fallen tribute. Can you imagine how traumatizing that would be? Picture Katniss, exhausted and fighting for her life, suddenly coming face to face with a monstrous creature that has Rue's eyes staring back at her. It's not just scary, it's emotionally devastating. The Capitol didn't just want tributes to kill each other. They wanted to force the survivors to face the people they had killed or watched died. It's like saying, hey, remember that kid you couldn't save? Well, you're going to have to fight them again. That's a whole new level of psychological torture. These mutts even wore collars with district numbers matching their tribute. The Capitol wanted them to know that they were fighting twisted versions of kids they knew, kids from specific districts, kids with names and families and dreams that were all taken away. It shows just how far the Capitol was willing to go in their cruelty. This explains why Katniss was so traumatized by the experience. She wasn't just fighting for her life against some scary animals. She was being forced to confront death in the most personal and horrifying way possible. Every time she struck one of the mutts, she was, in a way, killing a tribute all over again. The emotional weight of this scene is so much heavier in the books. It's not just about survival anymore. It's about guilt, trauma, and the absolute disregard for human dignity that the Capitol shows. They're not just content with killing kids, they want to use their bodies as weapons after they die. You know those eerily silent servants in the Capitol? Well, get ready for your skin to crawl because their story is about to make the Hunger Games even darker than you thought possible. Remember how the Capitol always found new ways to be absolutely horrifying? Well, the avox system takes the cake. It isn't just about punishing rebels. No, they had to go and make it as twisted as possible. They literally cut out people's tongues to silence them. Can you imagine? One day you're speaking out against the government and the next you can't even say your own name. But here's where it gets really messed up. One of those avoxes wasn't just some random rebel. She was someone Katniss knew. And the story behind it? It's going to make you see Katniss in a whole new light. So picture this, Katniss is out hunting one day and she sees this girl and her brother trying to escape District 12. Now you might think our hero would help them, right? Wrong. Katniss just watched as a hovercraft swooped in, killed the brother, and snatched up the girl. But wait, it gets worse. Later when Katniss is in the Capitol, guess who shows up as her servant? Yep, the same girl she saw get captured. And let me tell you, that girl recognized Katniss immediately. Can you imagine the fear, the anger, the betrayal she must have felt, seeing the person who could have helped her, who could have saved her brother, now being waited on hand and foot? And Katniss, she had to live with that guilt, seeing this girl every day knowing what she did or didn't do. It's like the Capitol designed this situation to mess with Katniss's head. And you know what? It probably worked. Now let's talk about what happened to this girl and all the other avoxes. They didn't just lose their ability to speak. The book describes it as only being able to make guttural sounds. Think about that for a second. These people can't even cry out in pain properly. They're trapped in their own bodies, unable to express themselves in the most basic human way. This wasn't just about punishing a few rebels. Oh no, the Capitol was way smarter than that. This was psychological warfare, plain and simple. Every time someone saw an avox, it was a reminder of what happens to people who step out of line. It was a walking, breathing warning saying, this could be you. And for the avoxes themselves, imagine living every day knowing that people look at you and see a cautionary tale. You're not even a person anymore. You're a symbol of the Capitol's power, of what happens when you dare to dream of freedom. You thought the Hunger Games were over when the tributes left the arena? Think again. The movies may have glossed over it, but the books reveal a much darker reality of what happened to our so-called victors. This might change how you see everyone's struggles in the Quarter Quell. Remember how Katniss and Peeta looked practically untouched after their first games? Yeah, that was a lie. The Capitol's advanced medicine might seem like magic, but some scars were meant to last forever, and I'm not just talking about emotional ones. Let's start with Katniss. You know the explosion in the cornucopia? It didn't just knock her off her feet. it actually left her deaf in her left ear. Can you imagine trying to survive in an arena where you can't even hear properly? It completely changed how she had to hunt and stay alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, she had to work twice as hard just to stay alive. Now let's talk about PETA. Remember his leg injury? In the movies, it seemed like he just kind of walked it off, but in the books, it was so much worse. They had to amputate his leg. Yeah, you heard that right. PETA lost his leg and had to use a prosthetic for the rest of his life. Can you imagine having to go through all of that trauma and then having to learn how to walk again? These weren't just minor setbacks for our characters. These injuries had a huge impact on both Katniss and PETA, especially when they had to go back into the arena for the Quarter Quell. The movies completely ignored this, but it was a big deal. Katniss had to constantly compensate for her hearing loss, always worrying that she might miss something crucial. And PETA? He was at a major disadvantage in terms of mobility and endurance. His leg was actually a major reason in the book that Katniss was concerned about PETA going back into the games. Think about the arena the victors were thrown into for the 75th Hunger Games. They started in the middle of the water, leaving PETA at a major disadvantage. It's not just about physical challenges though, think about the psychological impact. Every time Katniss struggled to hear something, she was reminded of the games. Every time PETA felt pain in his prosthetic leg, he relived those moments of terror. These weren't just injuries, they were constant reminders of what the Capitol had done to them. And you know what? That's exactly what the Capitol wanted. They didn't want to just break the kids in the arena. They wanted to make sure that they stayed broken. Every scar, every permanent injury was like a brand marking them as property of the Capitol. It really makes you think about what it means to be a victor in the Hunger Games. Sure, they got out of the arena alive, but at what cost? They didn't escape, not really. The arena stayed with them, in their bodies and in their minds. You think you know Johanna Mason from the movies? Let me tell you, that's just scratching the surface. Her real story is so much darker and more heartbreaking than what we saw on screen. When the Capitol captured Johanna, they didn't just rough her up a little. No, they set out to completely break her. And the way they did it, it'll make your skin crawl. They used a horrific combination of water torture and electric shocks. Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been? Water everywhere, making you feel like you're drowning, and the searing pain of electricity coursing through your body. But the Capitol and all their cruelty didn't stop there. They actually shaved Joanna's head to make sure the torture hurt as much as possible. Without her hair to absorb some electricity, every shock would have been excruciating. Now here's where this gets even more messed up. While they were torturing Johanna, she could hear PETA's screams echoing from where they were being held. And you know what? He could hear hers too. Just think about that for a second. Not only are you going through unimaginable pain, but you're forced to listen to someone else suffering just as much. It's like the Capitol wanted to make sure they broke not just their bodies, but their spirits too. After Johanna was finally rescued, the physical torture might have stopped, but the mental scars? Those stuck around. She couldn't even take a shower without having panic attacks. Something as simple as water on her skin was enough to send her right back to those moments of terror. The Capitol didn't just hurt her body, they stole her ability to feel safe around one of the most basic things in life. You want to know how deep this trauma went in the books? Johanna tried to join the mission to take down the Capitol. She was tough, she was angry, and she wanted revenge. But when it came time for the final test, all it took was a spray of water to completely unravel her. She panicked, she screamed, and just like that, her chance of fighting back was gone. The Capitol had won, even when she was far away from them. This wasn't just about hurting Johanna, this was calculated psychological warfare. The Capitol wanted to show that even the toughest victors, the ones who seemed unbreakable, could be reduced to nothing. They wanted to prove that they could take something as vital as water and turn it into a weapon, a constant reminder of their power. And you want to know what makes it even worse? Johanna never broke. Despite all the torture, despite all the pain and fear, she never gave up any information about the rebels. That's the kind of strength we're talking about here. But even that strength couldn't protect her from the lasting effects of what she went through. While Johanna's trauma was intense, she wasn't the only one carrying deep scars from the games. Remember Haymitch, the seemingly carefree drunk? His story is about to shatter everything you thought you knew about him. What if I told you that his drinking wasn't just a quirk, but a desperate attempt to survive? Let me paint the picture of the book Haymitch Abernathy. In the movies, he comes across as this gruff, boozy mentor with a few witty one-liners. But in the books, they show us a man who is so broken by his experiences that he can barely function. Picture this, it's reaping day in District 12. Everyone's tense, waiting to see which unlucky kids will be sent to their deaths this year. And then there's Haymitch, stumbling onto stage so drunk that he can barely stand. Before he can even slur out a word, he falls off the edge and has to be carried away by a stretcher. Yeah, you heard that right. Our supposed mentor and guide couldn't even make it through the ceremony without collapsing. But wait, it gets worse. When Peeta and Katniss first meet Haymitch on the train to the capital, they don't find some wise advisor. Nope, they find him passed out in his own vomit. Can you imagine that? These two terrified kids probably hoping for some guidance or comfort, and instead they have to clean up this mess of a man. They actually had to strip him naked and wash him off. Talk about a role reversal. These tributes were taking care of their mentor instead of the other way around. Now you might be thinking, okay, the guy likes to drink, what's the big deal? Well, let me tell you, this isn't just your average alcohol problem. Haymitch was drinking surgical grade alcohol. Yeah, the kind of stuff that they use to sterilize medical equipment. Regular booze just wasn't strong enough anymore. He needed something that would completely numb him, something that would make him forget. And can you blame him? Think about this for a second. Haymitch had been mentoring tributes for 23 years before Katniss and Peeta came along. That's 46 kids he watched die every single year. He had to stand by and watch as 2 more children from his district were sent off to be slaughtered. And not only did he have to watch, but he was supposed to help them, to give them hope when he knew deep down their chances were practically zero. Imagine what that does to a person. Every year he'd have to look into the eyes of 2 kids knowing that he was probably sending them to their death. He'd have to come up with strategies to give them advice, all while knowing in just a few days he'd probably be watching their bodies being lifted out of the arena. This wasn't just some character quirk or comic relief. Haymitch's drinking was his way of coping with unimaginable trauma. It was the only way he could face each new year, each new set of tributes. The alcohol wasn't making his life better, it was just making it bearable. And you know what's really messed up? The Capitol loved it. They got to point at Haymitch and say, see, this is what a victor looks like. This is what you have to look forward to when you win. His addiction wasn't just destroying him, it was sending a message to everyone in Panem about the true cost of the games. You think you know everything that happened in the Quarter Quell? Well, let me tell you, the movies left out something huge. Remember when Katniss woke up on the hovercraft with the syringe in her hand? Yeah, that wasn't just some random detail. It was actually a part of a plan so dark, it'll make you question everything you thought you knew about our girl on fire. So here's the deal. Katniss wasn't planning to use that syringe to save anyone. No, she was going to use that syringe to kill Peeta. I know, right? It sounds crazy, but hear me out. Katniss knew exactly what kind of monster President Snow was. She knew that if Snow got his hands on Peeta, he wouldn't just kill him, he'd torture him to death, slowly and painfully, just to hurt Katniss. Now you might be thinking, but Katniss loves Peeta, how could she even think about killing him? Well, that's exactly why she was considering it. In her mind, giving Peeta a quick and painless death was the kindest thing she could do for him. It was her way of protecting him from a fate worse than death. Just imagine what was going through Katniss's head in that moment. She's just been through all of that hell in the arena. She's exhausted, she's terrified, and now she's faced with this impossible choice. Does she let Peeta live, knowing he'll suffer unimaginably? Or does she take his life herself, knowing it might destroy her but save him from torture? This is the kind of decision that no one should have to make, especially a teenager who's been through that much trauma. But that's exactly what the Capitol does to people. It pushes them to their absolute limits, forcing them to consider things that would have been unthinkable before. And you know what's really messed up? Katniss never got the chance to make that choice. She couldn't find Peeta in time, which led to him being captured and, yeah, tortured by Snow. So now Katniss has to live with the guilt of not being able to save him and the knowledge of what he's going through because she failed. This moment really shows just how dark and desperate things had become. We're not talking about some heroic rescue mission here. We're talking about mercy killing. That's how bad things were. That's how little hope Katniss had left in the book. She was willing to kill the boy she loved because she thought it was the best thing she could do for him. It's moments like this that really drive home how messed up the world of Panem was. The Capitol doesn't just kill people. It doesn't just hurt them. It puts people in positions where they have to make impossible choices, and even the right decision feels like the wrong one. And think about what that says about Katniss and Peeta's relationship. Katniss is willing to carry the burden of killing Peeta to save him from suffering. That's not just love, that's a level of devotion and sacrifice that's almost scary in its intensity. It shows how deeply connected they've become through their shared trauma, how much they're willing to do to protect each other. While the movies mostly focused on Katniss and Peeta's relationship, there was another alliance formed behind the scenes, one that pushed both participants to their absolute limits. Let me tell you about the unexpected bond between Katniss and Johanna Mason. Remember how these two started off as rivals? Well, their relationship took a complete 180 after they escaped the Quarter Quell. In District 13, Katniss and Johanna actually became training partners. But this wasn't just any old workout routine. They called it preparation for the 76th Hunger Games, their way of psyching themselves up for the final assault on the Capitol. Now you might be thinking, okay, they worked out together, what's the big deal? But this was so much more than that. Both Katniss and Johanna were dealing with some serious trauma. They had both been through 2 Hunger Games and watched countless people die. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, Johanna had been tortured by the Capitol in ways that left deep emotional and psychological scars. But instead of letting that trauma break them, they used it to push each other harder. These training sessions were intense. They'd run for miles, testing their endurance and building up stamina. Then they'd move on to combat drills, testing themselves for whatever the Capitol might throw at them. But it wasn't just about getting physically stronger. Every step, every punch, every drop of sweat was about facing their fears head on. For Johanna, who had been tortured with water, even the simplest things like taking a shower could trigger panic attacks. But with Katniss by her side, she found strength to confront these fears. And Katniss, who was dealing with her own nightmares and anxiety, found Johanna as someone who truly understood the weight of what she was carrying. Their bond grew so strong that Johanna actually moved into Katniss's compartment in District 13. Can you imagine? 2 people who once saw each other as threats in the game, now sharing a living space, supporting each other through nightmares and panic attacks. It's like they created their own little support system in the middle of all of this chaos. What's really fascinating is how their relationship evolved. They went from being wary of each other in the arena to understanding each other like no one else could. They had both been through the games, lost people they loved, and wanted revenge on the Capitol. It's like they spoke a language only other survivors would understand, and it was completely left out of the movies. Their friendship wasn't built on shared interests or common backgrounds. It was forged in the fires of trauma and fueled by a burning desire for justice. Every time they trained together, every late night conversation, every moment of vulnerability brought them closer together. And you know what? This alliance might have been just as crucial for her survival as her relationship with Peeta. While Peeta represented hope and love, Johanna represented resilience and the fight for justice. Together, they created a force that the Capitol never saw coming. It's a shame the movies didn't give us more of this relationship because it really shows how trauma can create the most unexpected bonds. These 2 women who had every reason to distrust each other found strength in their shared experiences. They pushed each other to become stronger, face their fears, and keep going when everything felt hopeless. Madge Undersea, a character completely cut from the movie, was the daughter of District 12's mayor and a friend of Katniss's from school. After Katniss was picked in the Reaping, Madge was actually the person to give her the famous Mockingjay pin to wear in the arena. She was such an important friend to Katniss that she taught Madge how to shoot a bow after the 74th Hunger Games. And in return, Madge actually tried to teach Katniss how to play the piano. As for the conclusion to her story, Madge is one of the many people who lost their lives in the bombing of District 12 at the end of Catching Fire. You thought the Capitol was evil from what you saw in the movies? Let me tell you, that is just the tip of the iceberg. The books reveal a level of cruelty that's almost hard to believe. I'm talking about the kind of evil that makes you want to look away, but you can't because it's so shocking. Remember Peeta? Sweet, kind Peeta, who's always tried to see the good in people. Well, the Capitol decided to break him in the worst way possible. They forced him to watch as they tortured Darius and Avox to death. And this wasn't just a quick execution. No, they dragged it out over several days. Can you imagine being forced to watch someone you know suffer like that? Knowing that there's nothing you can do to help? It's the kind of thing that would haunt you forever. But the Capitol wasn't done with their mind games. Remember those mutts in the sewers during the assault on the Capitol? In the movies, they were just creepy lizard creatures. In the books, they were so much worse. These things were actually programmed to whisper Katniss in the voices of dead children. Just think about that for a second. Imagine hearing the voices of kids you knew, kids who died in the games, now coming after you to kill you in the bodies of monsters. It's not just scary, it's psychologically devastating. Now let's talk about Finnick. In the movies, he comes across as this confident, almost cocky guy. But the books reveal a much darker truth. He has actually one of the most cruel backstories in the entire trilogy. The Capitol actually forced him to sell his body, threatening to kill his loved ones if he refused. This wasn't just about control, it was about completely breaking someone's spirit. They took this strong, talented Victor and turned him into a puppet for their own sick games. And he was only 14 years old. Another chilling example of the Capitol's evil is what they did to Haymitch. We already discussed Haymitch and his drinking problem, but there's another detail about his trauma, one that was discussed more in the books. After he outsmarted the arena's force field in the games, President Snow had his entire family killed. Just like that, everyone Haymitch loved was gone, all because he dared to beat the Capitol at their own game. When you look at all of these examples together, you start to see the true nature of the Capitol's control. It wasn't just about keeping people poor or scared, it was about creating a world where hope itself was dangerous, where every act of kindness, every moment of joy could be turned against you. Suzanne Collins didn't pull any punches when she wrote these books. She wanted to show us the brutal reality of war and violence and how it changes people in ways that can't be undone. It's not just about the physical scars, though those are bad enough. It's about the psychological trauma that haunts these characters long after the games are over. So next time you watch the movies, remember you're only scratching the surface. The real story, with all of its pain, horror, and tiny moments of triumph, are hidden within the pages of the books.